Good evening. I'm Mark Shafer with Dr. Marty Gleason. We're giving a program for the Jefferson County Historical Society tonight. It's January 13. We're in the basement of the First National Bank. And this is kind of a killing two birds with one stone kind of a program. Normally we'd be giving this program at the museum in the Carnegie building, but we're in a state of transition up there, reorganizing displays and so forth, making room for the Earl Brown drugstore memorabilia collection. So Historical Society wanted a program for January, and I figured this would be a good chance to do a museum program, even though we're not in the museum. So we'll get started. About a year ago, Edith Jordan donated the flag that's here beside me on the easel to the museum. It dates to 1860. It's a campaign flag that was carried in a huge political rally here in, I think, October of 1860. Am I right?
I think
okay.
Right, yeah.
I hope so. I'm kind of doing this by the seat of my pants here. But it's really quite a significant little piece of Civil War memorabilia. Hannibal Hamlin was Lincoln's running mate for this election. Marty will tell you some more about that. But we're really grateful to the Jordan family for donating this wonderful artifact to the collection. Here on my left is a Courier and Ives print that advertises the candidacy of Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin. And you can see that it's a picture that predates Lincoln's beard. Everybody, I think, knows the story about the little girl that told him she thought he'd look better with a beard, so he grew one early in his presidency. The flag is pretty wonderful. It's obviously backwards. We were discussing that before the program. I don't know when flag etiquette was officially codified, but today we display the flag with the blue field in the other corner, and of course the stars are a kind of eccentric pattern. I don't think the simple rows of stars was really established until much later. People could kind of make the flags the way they wanted to. And of course it says Lincoln Hamlin across the stripes there in the middle. And Dr. Gleason, would you give us a little information about the man, Hannibal Hamlin? Because nobody knows who he is anymore.
Not many people do know about Hamlin. Occasionally you'll run across some people who are into presidents and presidential candidates and so forth. Hamlin was a very prominent politician in his day. He was born in Maine, lived most of his life in Maine, aside from the time that he spent in Washington, D.C. in politics. Born in 1809, so he truly was a contemporary of Lincoln's. They were roughly the same age. He was born into a family of wealth, and from that wealth there were certain things that he got used to, and part of that was power and influence, and throughout his life he exhibited a great appetite for those things. In his life there were some bumps. His father was reportedly the wealthiest man in Paris, Maine at the time, had financial setbacks, and Hamlin had always dreamed of a university education. At that time, that would have been in the 1820s, 1830s. That was a rare thing to find. To find anybody who was educated at all was rare. But it did cost some money. And because of the financial setbacks and to top it off, in 1829 his father passed away. He had to find a way to make some money to get himself educated. He taught school for a while in the public school. He tried surveying, he tried farming. Among all of those things, he never really found anything that he wanted to do. He ran across the opportunity to teach himself, and it doesn't really say how he was educated to become an attorney. But at any rate, he found a way to get himself educated to the point that he passed the Maine bar exam and became an attorney. He married shortly after that, and they moved to a little town of Hampton, Maine. Hampton, Maine was close to Bangor, which was the capital, and because he was an attorney, they ended up making him the city attorney. He had a lot of dealings with different people from the capital, and he gained a reputation that got himself elected to the state legislature in Maine.
And I think we have a pic, if you want to pull off that first placard, we have a picture that it appears to be a daguerreotype. It has that kind of scratchy surface like you see in those old photographs that shows him as a youngish man, maybe what, 35?
More than likely this would have been before he went to Washington, D.C. And yet he went to Washington at a very early age. Again, he became the city attorney, and through his dealings with various people in the capital, he got himself elected to the state legislature at the age of 26. Well, 1 year in the House of Representatives in the state of Maine, and he had become the Speaker of the House already. And to this day, he is the youngest person at age 27 to ever be the Speaker of the House for the state of Maine. Wasn't long then that he progressed in politics, and this is where he really found a niche for himself. He liked this much better than just the legal books. He was into politics and creating laws. He won his first seat in the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, in 1843. By 1848, he had won a seat in the Senate, and that's where he really found a home. So in 1848, he'd become a United States Senator, and he was kind of a wheeler-dealer. He really liked the power that the office of Senate brought him. He was able to create jobs for friends. He was able to find appointments, and a lot of people clamored to him for favors. And being in the position he was in, he was able to grant those things many times. Basically, when the election of 1860 came around, he had been a Democrat, and he got so upset by the various things that were going on with the politics of the upcoming Civil War to be. Various things bothered him a great deal. He was more or less on the radical end of the abolitionist movement. He believed in no slavery anywhere. When the Democratic Party, of which he was a part, Stephen A. Douglas was the big promoter of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And because that the rest of the Democratic Party supported this wholeheartedly, he told them that if we pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, I will resign from the Democratic Party. And on June 2nd of 1856, he did just that. He went ahead and resigned as a Democrat. Well, the newly formed Republican Party in Maine was anxious to get their hands on him because he was a very viable candidate, and they wanted the governorship in Maine. They didn't have a viable candidate, and they begged for him to be their candidate to run for the Republican candidacy for the governor of Maine. He agreed to do that. Basically, he agreed to use his name and his reputation to gain the governorship for the Republican Party on one condition, and this was his wheeler-dealer side now. He liked to make the deals, and he did it in a kind of a backroom, smoke-filled backroom way. But the deal was, I will gain the governorship for you if you will put me back in my Senate seat as a Republican within a very short time after I become governor. Well, he did win the election, and by a landslide, spent 1 month as the governor of Maine and was promptly put back into the United States Senate. So at least the people he dealt with were true to their word and followed up with their promise. So at this point, he's gained himself quite a reputation. He's back in the U.S. Senate. He was a proponent of Lincoln. He followed Lincoln when Lincoln started running in his candidacy for president. And at one point, his supporters wanted him to run for president, but he wanted to put that out of their mind and put that down. As it came to be, in the Republican National Convention, which was held in Chicago that year, it was during the summertime of 1860, Lincoln won the nomination. In order to keep peace within the Republican Party, they allowed his opponent, William Henry Seward, who was a senator at that time, they allowed his supporters to pick the vice presidential candidate. So it was never really Lincoln's pick. But the supporters of Seward on the first ballot picked Hamlin to be their vice presidential candidate. Hamlin was not pleased with that whole idea. He very much liked it in the Senate. And what he had seen in politics in Washington, D.C., he found very quickly that a vice president was just a contingent somebody. Didn't have a lot of power. He was only important if the president died. So at this point, do you have anything to add? Or?
Well, one of the sources that you gave me from the internet said that Hamlin found out about his nomination while he was playing cards. He wasn't even in the, wasn't even at the convention site when the decision was made. I guess that's about all I have to say, except we have one more picture of him. Mm-hmm. He's one of the favorite sons of the state of Maine, and this is the statue of him at Statuary Hall in the Capitol in Washington. So that gives you an idea of his stature in terms of his home state. And I believe that statue was made in the 30s at some point. I've agreed to talk about the Wide Awakes, which were the political branch of the Republican Party that made this flag possible for us tonight. And Marty, if you would go to the next picture, I believe. I can't remember if it's the torch or the...
That's the torch.
Okay, it's the torch. I'm going to do a lot of reading tonight because I don't have everything memorized like this Civil War buff over here does. So as a school teacher who's usually shooting from the hip, I'm not used to reading my speeches, but I'll do it tonight. The Wide Awakes were a radical wing of the Republican Party with a very strong anti-slavery platform. They were active early supporters of Abraham Lincoln and famous for organizing impressive night parades, and that's what this flag here is a relic of. They carried lanterns and wore distinctive clothing. Within weeks of their organization, now this is specifically here we're talking about Connecticut, and I'll backtrack a little bit. Abraham Lincoln had made a speech in Hartford on Monday, March 5th, 1860, and he got the most applause from this statement. Quote, "Now what is the difficulty with the slavery question? Those who own them look upon them as property. The free states carry on their government on the principle of the equality of men. If the Republicans, who think slavery is wrong, get possession of the general government, we may not root out the evil at once, but may at least prevent its extension." And it goes on to say that Lincoln would deliver similar speeches in all parts of New England. And of course, New England was a big kind of anti-slavery stronghold, so that was an important move for him to make politically. Anyway, after finishing the speech in Hartford, Lincoln entered the waiting carriage and was surrounded by 20 to 30 young men with glazed black caps and capes swinging torchlights. And this would be one of the torchlights, or similar to one that they would carry. When I first saw this picture, I thought it was like an artificial flame like you see on the Statue of Liberty, but it's actually a wad of wicking. If you look at it closely, there's all these little
pieces of wick, and I assume it made a much better flame that way. So it looks like a flame, an artificial kind of sculpted flame sticking out of the torch.
The wick. Anyway, this small but organized group is said to be the first procession of the newly organized.
And the name was taken from a Daily Current, and I suppose that's the name of the newspaper locally, editorial the next day. But the Wide Awakes, I think Marty mentioned, grew to
Close to 400,000.
400,000. This organization, within weeks of this March 5th speech,
And soon there were Republican clubs all over the country who were adopting the Wide Awake name, and the affiliation became one of the most potent political forces in our nation's history. Now, on the other side of the question, Marty was able to find on the websites devoted to this a speech by Senator Louis T. Wigfall of Texas, And this was delivered in the Senate on December 6th, 1860. Now that would have been after the secession of South Carolina,
Just right about that time.
but evidently Texas was still in the Union. This is what Senator Wigfall of Texas had to say about the Wide Awakes. In the state in which I live during the last summer, there were 4 towns that I know of, county sites burned smooth to the ground. There were 14 other settlements that were burned down. Strychnine was brought and given to our Negroes for the purpose of poisoning their members of the Methodist Church North. And carry out the irrepressible conflict to burn our towns, burn up the stores of our merchants, burn up the mills to bring free soil, northern capital in, and thus get possession of Texas and make it a free state in order, as they said, to belt us around with free states, to
or cause us like poisoned rats to die in our holes. And later Secretary of State Seward basically says, well, I don't know who you're talking about. These are not the wide awake Republicans that I know about. So that gives you kind of the other side of the picture from the South's
perception of the Wide Awakes as being radical meddlers and basically bad people. Now, much to my chagrin, when I went up to the museum to retrieve this framed flag tonight, I found this great big article on the back. Edith, had you taped that to the back? That tells about the 1860 Wide Awake rally in which this flag was paraded. And I won't try to read all of it, but it came from
Sesquicentennial edition of the Ledger, July 28, 1989, and I have to take my glasses off for this. And I'll just briefly scan this article. It was the largest political rally ever held in Jefferson County, said to have drawn a crowd of 25,000 people. It was in October of 1860, and they said the roads were just jammed with wagons and carriages coming from all over southeast Iowa.
Governor spoke, Senator Harlan.
I mean, it was quite a prestigious gathering. And this is what the weekly ledger of the of Fairfield said. It's their Friday, October 19th, 1860 issue. The headlines read, "The greatest meeting in Iowa, the people alive, 25,000 people in council, ain't you glad you joined the Republicans, 2,300 wide awakes, Old Abe ahead, 600 mounted Minutemen, Lincoln Guards, and others, Douglas gone home to his mother." That would be Stephen Douglas, the Democratic candidate. Delegation representing states, Lincoln at Liberty, march on, yada, 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 keep the campfires burning, and so forth. The article says that it costs $2 to join, and you've got an oilcloth, I cannot talk tonight, an oilcloth cap and cape, and that would kind of fit with this reference over here in this previous document where they had glazed black caps. So it must have been oilcloth was the standard material it was made of. So for $2, you got the cap and the cloak, a torch, and I don't know if it would be a fancy torch like the one we have in this illustration, or what. But anyway,
and then the Lincoln Hamlin
flag, and that's what we have right here with us tonight. Yeah, go ahead, take the next picture down.
I'm pretty sure the torches were not all just like this,
No.
because
They
it said in several sources that you had to provide your own torch.
Okay.
They had tar on a big pole stick.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and speaking of poles and stakes, that was Frankie Beatty mentioning
Grandma
tarred
Beatty.
poles. Her husband's grandmother, Grandma Beatty, marched in this procession back in 1860.
And so proud of it.
And she was very proud of it, and it was unusual in that time for women to take such an active part in politics. The article goes on to say that the wagons and carriages were bedecked with wide awake banners and Lincoln Hamlin, signs and ribbons and so forth. And I lost my train of thought again. Ah, yes, the picture. Is that the group?
That's the group.
These are the officers. These are the officers, and we don't know which officers. I suspect it was from Connecticut, because that was in connection with this internet piece of information. But I went ahead and highlighted the torches. They're with the yellow highlighter, and they're a lot like the torch that you saw earlier. And then some of the men have lanterns. And this is not a real clear picture. By the time you blow up some of these internet images, the resolution's not real clear, but I think it gives you the idea. But it shows the little caps. It looks like the kepi that privates would wear in the Civil War regiments. And I'll bet they were kind of sleazy looking, don't you think? Kind of oilcloth. I can't imagine it was very,
But it
very
also
spiffy, but
lent itself to people who were not too sure what this was all about to assume that they had a military function because there was a uniform.
and that would lead this Lewis Wigfall of Texas to assume that they were a bunch of terrorists because they were quasi-military and the way they marched and so forth. Anyway, back to the tar pole. One of the things that they did was put up poles, and it's a matter of honor to put up a pole faster and taller than any of the Douglas Democrats. And they mentioned Glasgow and Purley in this article and how they had a 150-foot pole, and they flew a flag from it, and on and on and on. But it sounded like it was a very, very impassioned, kind of idealistic movement. And for that many people to swell from 20 young men in Hartford, Connecticut to 400,000 within a few months, considering transportation and communication at that time, and it just shows you that ideas can really spread like wildfire. But I assume this little flag was on a little pole. You can just see people.
Of these in the torchlight, 25,000 people, that's a big parade. And I don't know if this went on for several days or not, but it sounds like Fairfield had a pretty active group. The local group was founded by Senator Wilson. I mean, he was later senator. He probably was Representative Wilson at that time. And I know the Jordans were involved with this early group. I think.
This did not belong, this didn't come from the Jordan family.
Okay.
Scott got it from a Miss Emery.
Okay, so this came from Miss Emery. Okay.
Frankie, you may have heard the name.
Was it Maddie's parents, and she was the principal of the high school?
I don't know.
Well, anyway, Miss Emery owned this flag.
Parents, yeah.
But I know in Susan Folty's book of Fairfield, the Jordan name is mentioned as being founding members of the Wide Awakes.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I think. I might be wrong.
Closely, okay. James Wilson signed the Fairfield Constitution first, followed by Dr. C.S. Clark, J.A. McKimey, G.A. Wells, Harry Jordan, W.W. Junkin, and many others.
And that's why I had assumed, Edith, that this...
Wells was a brother-in-law of Harry.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's why I assumed it was your
They
family,
didn't have
because...
a flag, or they threw it away.
Well, I imagine a lot of them got thrown away. But we're thrilled to have this added to the museum collection. And when it goes on display, there's the big Civil War case in the museum. And, I mean, this is not official, but in my mind, the best place for it is right by that Rogers group with Lincoln, Grant, and Secretary of War Stanton.
Council of War.
Yeah. I think that would be a really good spot for it. And I'm so glad this clipping's on the back. And I think what we'll do is put an envelope of this information on the back of it also, so that it doesn't get separated. So I think that gives you a pretty good idea of what was going on in this county. It wasn't just in Fairfield, but it was Purley, Glasgow, just all over the place. And I think Marty's going to talk now about Lincoln and emancipation and how Lincoln's attitudes towards slavery changed over the years.
Again, it was enlightening to read a Fairfield, the book, because it brought to life a lot of the things that we may or may not have known about the Civil War and what the ancestors who lived here, how they felt and dealt with all of those issues. It was much more contentious here than I would have thought. There were an awful lot of people who were pro-slavery and pro-South. There were just an awful lot of people who were anti-war, whatever that took. But at any rate, the election of Lincoln was not won by a landslide here. It was a relatively close election. And there were lots of things that went on here. And, if you're interested, you need to read that chapter in the book of Fairfield by Susan Welty, because it's very interesting and brings a lot of the family names out and who was involved with this and that, and very enlightening as to what that was like at that time here in Fairfield. Getting back to Lincoln and Hamlin. Hamlin and Lincoln didn't really know each other all that well. Lincoln had not been in Washington, D.C. long enough for the wheeler dealer Hamlin to really get to know him, although he knew his reputation. When they had been put together on the presidential campaign button as running mates, Lincoln sent him a letter, said, "Why don't you come to Chicago in 2 weeks and let's get to know each other." At that point in time, Lincoln used Hamlin, one of the only times he actually did use Hamlin and listen to him, to help pick his cabinet. In that cabinet, again, were a lot of influential people. Hamlin knew these people better than Lincoln would have, and at one instance, Lincoln even allowed Hamlin to pick his own New England cabinet member, and he picked Gideon Welles. I don't know if there's any connection with the Wells that were here in Fairfield, but at any rate, he chose Gideon Welles to be Secretary of the Navy at the time of the Civil War. Probably wasn't a real good pick, because later on in the reading they talked about how those two grew to loathe each other. At any rate, Hamlin felt very disenfranchised as the vice president. He sat in an office and moped, and he was constantly working on Lincoln and Lincoln's cabinet members to gain appointments and influence and get jobs for friends that he used to be able to do himself, but as the vice president had no power anymore. And so they viewed him as a little bit of an aggressor. They also viewed him much as a pest. So they Lincoln, they just kind of set him off in a room and oftentimes sent him out of town to do little jobs so he just wouldn't have to deal with all the pester. The one time that Lincoln truly used him was when he was drawing up the Emancipation Proclamation. To be honest, Lincoln had considered this for some time, and Hamlin had suggested that he do such a thing, because Hamlin, again, was very much an abolitionist and felt like that the Civil War was being fought for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons that he wanted to push forth was his agenda to have no more slavery in America. Lincoln was working on this in the summer of 1862. The Emancipation Proclamation was not announced or delivered to the American public until January 1st of 1863. So there was a lot of time and effort and thought that went into it. One of the few times Lincoln used Hamlin, the two actually got together, rode a horse, their horses over to the soldiers' home so that they could be alone and away from any prying ears and prying eyes, and they worked on the Emancipation together. Lincoln presented the article to Hamlin and asked if he had any ideas to correct anything that needed changed, and Hamlin was very impressed with the proclamation as it was. Upon pressing him further, he did change a little bit of the wording. So the Emancipation Proclamation is largely Lincoln's work, but Hamlin did have a fair amount of work with him, and a little bit of change went into that to help make it so that we had no more slavery in America. The idea of why it took so long to actually deliver this proclamation to the American public, Lincoln was always thinking. He was very much a strategist, and the war was not going well for the North at that time, and he did not want to make the Emancipation seem like he was pleading for help or begging for mercy or any of those things. He wanted it to be more of a statement, but he needed the North to start winning some battles and doing a little better for him to actually release that to the public and not make it look like a weak or a wimpy statement there. So he actually did not do this until January 1 of 1863. 63 was a big year, and that's when everything started turning for the North, and things did start going better that way. Hamlin was not used again very much through the whole thing, and when he actually got removed from the Republican ticket for the election in 1864, it was much Lincoln's doing. Lincoln engineered removing him from the ticket, and again the thought being that Hamlin represented the abolitionist vote for the Republican Party, which they felt like they already had. What they needed to get was more votes that they did not already have secured, and so what they did is they went out and got Andrew Johnson, who was the governor of the state of Tennessee at the time, and got a lot of the votes that would have been garnered through him, who were maybe anti-war or pro-Reconstruction type votes. And you know, by doing that, and by the North also starting to do better in the Civil War, he became more of an electable presidential candidate. But Hamlin was removed, and he wasn't altogether sorry, but it always stuck in his craw that Lincoln was the one that decided that he shouldn't be on the ticket that next time.
Well, thank you. Gosh, I think we've left no stone unturned. The thing that amazes me about an artifact like this is how rich the background information connected with it really is. And once again, Mrs. Jordan, thank you so much for donating it. This is really a real prize.
Scott had a hand in it too. He and I talked about it.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah.
Quite a number of years before.
But it'll be a wonderful addition to the Civil War case. And I also want to thank the Jefferson County Education Foundation. They made these nice easels possible. I borrowed those from my classroom at the high school, and they're not too messed up with paint yet, so I felt like they were presentable. But we got a great price on them. They were half price, and I thought, by golly, I'm gonna get a grant from the Education Foundation. And I believe the current president is seated to my left of that organization, so I wanted to make a public acknowledgement of that. But anyway, thank you so much for inviting us to speak to the Historical Society. And on behalf of the Carnegie Historical Museum, I bid you a good night.